This lesson is entitled Land of the Pharaohs. It is from 3100 BC to 2000 BC. Our read to learn is what role did the pharaohs play in ancient Egypt? Our vocabulary is unification, pharaoh, economy, hieroglyphics, scribe, papyrus, people, Menes or Menes, Khufu, places are Memphis and Thebes. I'll start with the read aloud. About 3100 BC, two mighty kings met in battle. One king wore a white crown and ruled over a long stretch of the Nile in Upper Egypt. The other king had a red crown and controlled a large area in Lower Egypt. The outcome of the battle was enormous importance. Whoever won it controlled the biggest kingdom in the world. You have already read that the farming towns began appearing in different parts of the world during the New Stone Age. Some towns grew in small cities as people specialized and developed trade with neighboring towns. These communities created rules to promote peace and fairness among neighbors. Village leaders were usually in charge of creating these rules and making sure that the rules were followed. As the communities grew larger, their governments changed to meet many new needs. Along the Nile River in Egypt, groups of villages joined together under the leadership of kings. These larger communities developed complex systems of government. Soon the people of the Nile River Valley would see even greater changes in the way the communities were run. Union of Two Crowns. Along the Nile River 5,000 years ago, Egypt's villages were thriving. Farmers were learning how to produce more surplus crops. Craft workers in villages were using new technologies to make tools, pottery, and jewelry. How do you think this affected trade? As you may have guessed, the Nile River became crowded with boats as trade increased between towns. Egypt joins together. In the midst of all this activity, there was terror and fear. Ruins of walls around early towns and paintings of bloody battle scenes suggest that there were many wars between villages. To better protect themselves and their belongings, the people along the Nile banded together into two separate kingdoms. Towns in Upper Egypt supported a king who wore a white crown. Towns in Lower Egypt followed a king who wore a red crown. Then, about 3100 BC, this changed. Forces led by Menes, the king of the Upper Egypt, swept north into the Nile Delta. Menes' army overthrew the king of Lower Egypt. To show his victory, Menes wore a double crown. It combined his white crown with the red crown of Lower Egypt. This change stood for the unification of Egypt. Unification is joining of separate parts into one. Following this unification of two kingdoms, Menes became the first pharaoh of Egypt. The word pharaoh actually refers to the great palace in which the rulers lived. Later it became the name given to all the rulers of Egypt. The time when Egypt's early pharaohs worked to build unity within the country is called the Old Kingdom. It lasted from 2686 BC until 2181 BC. Two other major periods in ancient Egypt's history, the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom, would follow. And if you look at the picture below, this is the crown. So here's the red crown. This is the double, the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, and here is the white crown. Life in the Old Kingdom. At first, Egypt's pharaohs did not greatly change the civilization that they ruled. They mainly added to the practices of local government, trade, and religion that had existed for hundreds of years along the Nile. In time, though, the pharaoh became the center of civilization. His or her actions shaped the fate of all of Egypt. Government under the pharaohs. After unification, the most powerful local leaders in Egypt were made area governors for the new government. They performed some of the same services as your local leaders. They were in charge of collecting taxes in their areas and served as local judges. They had different duties as well. The ancient Egyptian governors made sure that the precious floodwaters were shared fairly among farmers through the use of canals and storage pools. The area governors reported to the pharaoh's headquarters in Memphis, Egypt's capital city. Memphis was located between Upper and Lower Egypt, near present-day Cairo. From the place in Memphis, the pharaoh decided how Egypt's affairs should be run, from the highest to the lowest levels. The pharaoh had a great political power in Egypt. He or she had great religious powers as well. In fact, Egyptians believed that the pharaoh was a child of the sun god Ra. Just as Egyptians believed that Ra gave life to earth, so they believed the pharaohs gave life to Egypt and its people. Just as Ra deserved to be worshipped, so did too the pharaoh. If you look at the map here too, Lower Egypt's up here and Upper Egypt's down here. And you might think it's a little strange, but remember that the Nile River flows from south to north. So Upper and lower. So it starts here and ends here. And remember, here's our delta. Ra was the most important of the many gods whom ancient Egyptians worshipped. Egyptians believed different gods had different roles. For example, one god caused the flooding of the Nile. Another gave potters and metalworkers their creativity. Other gods took the form of snakes or crocodiles. The god Isis protected people from sickness and harm. Her husband Osiris represented the dead who awaited rebirth. Osiris was important because belief in the afterlife was essential to the religion of Egypt. Egyptians believed that after a person died, he or she would go to the next world. Egyptians believed that the dead could take food and objects into the next world. Thus, food and belongings were buried with the dead. Ancient Egyptians preserved the bodies of the dead royalty with a process called mummification. The bodies were dried and wrapped in strips of cloth. Sometimes pets, such as cats, were also mummified to accompany their owners into the afterlife. Egypt's economy. Since the pharaoh was considered a god of all things in Egypt, it belonged to him or her. This put the pharaoh at the center of Egypt's economy. The economy of the country is the way people manage money and resources for the production of goods and services. Egypt's economy was based on agriculture. Farmers produced a surplus of food which fed the whole country. How was the surplus divided? The main way was through taxes. The pharaoh collected a large part of every farmer's crops each year as taxes. The grain, eggs, meat, fruit, and olive oil were then used to feed the pharaoh's family and servants. The goods were also used to pay for any other items the pharaoh wanted. The pharaoh also took taxes on everything else made in Egypt, such as leather goods, linen, cloth, and baskets. The pharaoh even taxed people's time. During the flood season, for example, Egyptians, from priests to potters to farmers, were called upon to build canals or buildings for the government. Egypt's craft workers and artists depended on the pharaohs for their jobs. These people spent most of their time working to keep Egypt's many temples supplied. For example, temples needed golden bowls and statues. Since the pharaoh owned all of Egypt's temples, it was the government's job to pay for all the supplies they used. No money changed hands, since money did not exist in Egypt at that time. Rather, goods of equal value were traded. For their efforts, craft workers received clothes and food. And the bottom picture, we have mummies were wrapped in cloth and covered with masks before being put into coffins. Remember, they believed that people went into the next world. Therefore, they also buried items with them. A system of writing. How was it possible for the pharaoh's government to keep track of all of its business details? How could it make sure, for example, that a farmer in Upper Egypt was paying taxes or that a temple in the Delta had enough linen? The pharaoh's local governors helped by communicating with the pharaoh's government in Memphis. What made this communication possible was a system of writing. Ancient Egyptians developed a system of writing sometime after unification. This system, called hieroglyphics, was made up of about 800 picture sites. These individual picture signs or symbols were called hieroglyphs. Hieroglyphs could stand for objects such as bread or for sounds such as an S. Hieroglyphics are the reason why we know so much about the lives of ancient Egyptians. The life of the scribe. Pharaohs depended on written records to keep their government in order. A number of writers called scribes traveled throughout Egypt to keep records of details, great and small. They were out in the fields with the local leaders to record how much grain farmers harvested. Scribes also determined how much farmers owed to the government. Scribes drafted letters and marriage contracts for townspeople. Because writing was taught to only a few, scribes were highly respected in the Egyptian culture. It was a great honor to become a scribe. Only boys could become a scribe, and they began training when they were about 10 years old. Each day in school, they changed passages aloud to improve their reading skills. Then they spent hours writing out lessons and stories over time. If their attention wandered, they ran the risk of being beaten. Junior scribes used broken pottery as their scrap paper. Writing on paper. After the boys mastered a simple type of hieroglyphs used for record keeping, they graduated to writing on papyrus. Papyrus is a reed plant that grows along the Nile. Ancient Egyptians used these reeds to make a kind of paper also called papyrus. Papyrus paper was not very different from the paper we use today. Did you notice how similar the words papyrus and paper are? Our modern word comes from the ancient one. Scribes used sharpened reeds as pens. They dipped the reeds into small discs of red or black ink. Then the scribes carefully wrote the information they needed to record on their rolls of their papyrus paper. Scribes also had to have good penmanship. They also needed to be good at math. After all, they had to keep correct records of the pharaohs and many goods. Scribes also figured out the number of workers and the amount of materials needed to complete building projects. The key to the lost language. By about AD 400, hieroglyphs fell out of use and their meaning was lost. The ancient symbols found on Egyptian tombs and walls were a mystery to the people who came upon them many centuries later. In 1799, a French soldier was digging in the Nile Delta town of Rosetta. There he found a large black stone with writing on it. The stone was later called the Rosetta Stone after the place where it was found. It contained passages of written 3 times in hieroglyphs, Greek, and another type of Egyptian called Demotic. By comparing the 3 languages, a French scholar named Jean-François Champlain worked to solve the mystery of the hieroglyphs. By 1822, he succeeded. Look at the photograph of the Rosetta Stone. How has its writing helped historians? So it says Champlain recognized the symbols for Ptolemy, a later Egyptian pharaoh. The Rosetta Stone records many of Ptolemy's deeds. For example, the pharaoh lowered taxes, rebuilt certain temples, and freed prisoners. The stone had the same message in 3 languages. From the top, hieroglyphs, slate, Egyptian, Demotic, and Greek. And actually, you could see the different divisions, 1, 2, and 3. Building the pyramids. No project could have been more challenging to scribes than keeping track of building the pyramids. These huge stone structures were built as tombs or burial places for the pharaoh. The Great Pyramid in the Old Kingdom's most spectacular monument, it is by far the biggest of all pyramids built in Egypt's history. Pharaoh Khufu ordered a construction to begin about 2600 BC. This mountain of stone was to be his tomb. It would bring glory not only to himself but to all of Egypt. He would be buried inside with many belongings that he would take into the afterlife. The 20-year project involved as many as 100,000 people and took a huge amount of Egypt's resources. Few families escaped the call to work at the site. Large amounts of Egyptian taxes went to feed and clothe the project's workers. Even the Nile River landscape changed. Entire cliffs of stone were cut into blocks to make up the pharaoh's great stone monument. Look at the diagram on page 80 to see the construction of the Great Pyramid. So if you look at the construction of the Great Pyramid, we have the average weight of a block was 2.5 tons. The total number of blocks was 2,300,000. The number of blocks added each day was 285. And there was an underground room, a queen's chamber, a king's chamber, and there was air shafts. And if you could see, they are building up into the pyramids. This must have been very hard work. So why does this all matter? Khufu was not only the pharaoh who demanded such massive building projects. Other rulers during the Old Kingdom called for similar, if smaller, monuments. The huge projects took their toll on Egypt's economy and people. Anger against the pharaohs probably began to grow. Egypt's hard-won unity started breaking down. Remember the unity between the Old Kingdom, the lower, if we go back, unification between Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. Remember that? Egypt's hard-won unity started breaking down. Local governments began resisting the orders of the pharaohs. In about 2000 BC, leaders in Upper Egypt revolted and eventually set up a new pharaoh. They based their new capital in the southern town of Thebes. So the capital went from Memphis to Thebes. With the division of the country, the Old Kingdom came to an end. The breakdown of the Old Kingdom, however, led to the rise and even greater civilizations in ancient Egypt. The next lesson tells how the pharaohs learned from their mistakes. They stopped building pyramids. Instead, they built the richest and most powerful civilization the world had ever known. So here are our main ideas. In Egypt to form the largest government in the world. Pharaoh was central to Egypt's government, economy, and religion. The writing system of Egypt, called hieroglyphs, provided a